What we also know, and it's the work of Moy et al. In Australia, is that they have shown that the test weight in planktic foraminifera also varies between the glacials and interglacials. So what I think we've been able to do, and this is the work that Deborah Wool-Palmer is doing, is showing how over the last 250,000 years, and possibly longer, fossil, they're not, well, yeah, they are fossil, they're not that old as we normally work on, but these fossil records of PCO2 dissolution acidification give us a picture of what the background rates of change have been over that length of time, and we can compare that to modern changes. So the summary of that is that these pteropod assemblages, and we've also looked at cores from the Mediterranean. We're also trying to get enough samples to work on from the Gulf of California, but that's proving a little bit more problematic. But we've recently got information of a plankton tow right from the northern latitudes to the Antarctic, which has collected pteropods the whole way. So hopefully we're going to get some more distributional data on the pteropods. Now, before we say that this really affects the geological record and that we've seen all this before, we have to think about what the geological record includes. Here's the time scale from the present day, naught down to 550 million years ago, which many of you might not work with, I know, but bear with me, because in this interval here we have the Paleogene, the Cretaceous and the Jurassic, and of course it's the rocks at Ericea, which are in the lower Cretaceous, which are around about 125 to 130 million years ago. And working on those rocks gives us a view, and the chalk cliffs of southern England, of what things were like in what Stanley and Hardy, 12 years ago now, called the calcitic ocean, because the modern ocean is dominated by aragonite. But these fossil oceans were dominated by calcite. But if you go further back, they were dominated again by aragonite. And so when you look at things like corals, the corals arose back here about 450 million years ago in a calcitic ocean. There was then the major extinction event at the end of the Permian, and the new corals appeared, the scleractinian corals, in an aragonitic ocean, as, in a moment I'll show you, did the planktic foraminifera. And so what we have to do when we're looking at changes caused by acidification in the geological past, we actually have to remember where we are in the geological column and what the nature of the ocean system was. And so these chalk cliffs are in a calcitic ocean. And we have to think, can the Ischia model or any other model really hold true in that sort of environment? Well, when we look back in the geological record, there's all sorts of evidence that atmospheric PCO2 was higher. Royer and Greg Ritalik and others have used stomatal indices to show that CO2 concentrations have fluctuated over the geological past. And so this is the geocarb model. And if you just focus on this grey line, very high levels in the early part of the geological record, and then a drop in the Permo-Carboniferous ice ages, a rise in the Mesozoic, and then the present levels today. And so when we look at some of the record within the geological past, we can see that there is a model at the Triassic-Jurassic boundary which indicates a rather brief but nevertheless quite sharp rise in PCO2. Houtman in 2004 said there was a calcification crisis, which immediately everybody then said was ocean acidification. And we have this curve produced in various ways in Greenland and Sweden to say that there was this PCO2 rise and supposed acidification event. Now you have to be very careful to begin interpreting some of the fossil record in terms of this sort of acidification, because at the same time, in this interval here, when PCO2 levels were supposed to be high, the benthic foraminifera were abundant. You can see the various taxonomic groups here. These were really abundant, but they were made of aragonitic shells. And aragonitic shells should have suffered the worst if it was acidification. But as we saw in the Wagner Basin in the Gulf of California, while they're alive, they can protect themselves from acidification. However, once they die and lose their protoplasm, they should begin to dissolve. And yet many of these specimens that I've seen from Austria and other parts of the Alps are beautifully preserved. And yet there is evidence, a lot of people believe it, that there was an acidification event. But we have to be very careful how we interpret the information. And for example, this is the base of the Jurassic, around about 200 million years ago. And a lot of these taxa here have got these aragonitic shells. And so we really do find a problem in interpreting it. As you come up through the Jurassic, around about 180 million years ago, there was this oceanic anoxic event, which is this grey. It belongs in a particular ammonite zone. There's a rise in sea level. There was supposed to be warm conditions. Again, it's been attributed to PCO2 levels. But again, at that particular time, what we find is a flood of these aragonitic forms. However, just above that level, here in this rapid recovery period, what we find is the appearance of these taxa, which are the first planktic foraminifera. And they seem to have arisen from aragonitic benthic forms. These taxa, the Oberhauserella group. And then the planktic foraminifera suddenly expand through the Jurassic in this aragonitic ocean. But then, towards the end of the Jurassic, they begin to tail off as we switch into a calcitic ocean, and the aragonitic planktic foraminifera are replaced by the calcitic forms, which carry on through into the Cretaceous. So the calcite aragonite ocean issue is really quite important at looking at the fossil record. Now these are some of the earliest planktic foraminifera. These are sort of mid-Jurassic, and I think even one of our second-year undergraduates would certainly identify these as related to modern Globigerina. They just look like modern Globigerina, but believe me, they're not. They come from this area of central Poland, and they were collected well away from the ocean in this massive old quarry that you find just outside this famous historical town with an almost unpronounceable name, apart from Zusha can pronounce it. Well, of course, modern planktic foraminifera, you know what they look like. They live within this frothy protoplasm, and they were first described really by Alcide d'Orbigny, who described Globigerina in 1826, and this was the first drawing he made. in 1826 of Globigerina, which just looks like those Jurassic things. And of course, at the time, he didn't realize the planktic mode of life, and it was only the HMS Challenger expedition and the work of those people like Brady, who first described Globigerina as a planktonic or a planktic organism. And this is one of the original drawings from Brady's monograph in 1884. And there's a modern species, and these are our Jurassic forms. So when we're looking at these Jurassic forms, and even those in the Cretaceous, we can compare their morphology, shell structure, and everything else quite well to their mode of life to see if they are changing their test weights, changing their diameter, changing their structures in response to ocean acidification. Well, this is where they first appeared back in the Jurassic, 180 million years ago. They really didn't develop too much. They had a complete free ocean to grow in, but their diversity did not go up very much. Then there was the change to a calcitic ocean, and only one or two taxa survived that change and went on virtually unchanged for about 20 million years into the Cretaceous, before suddenly expanding in numbers. Now, these are some of the earliest forms, 178 million years ago, 172 million years ago. And this sample from southern Poland, these are all planktic foraminifera, they're all touching each other. It is really the first oceanic planktonic ooze, and that is a mid-Jurassic event. But if this is a paleogeographic map of Europe at the time, they are only known from this area here. And it's really fascinating that because of this paleogeography and understanding where they are found, this is one of the first examples where we can actually take a planktic group of organisms and see them expand and migrate into the world's oceans, because this is where they all started from. And they were even in large numbers but low diversity. This is that dot is that one there. But we know them from very few locations. So why did they suddenly expand at this particular point? About 120 million years ago. They really diversified. Well, what happened then was oceanic crust suddenly expanded in terms of production. This is about 125 million years ago, and you see that ocean crust almost doubled in terms of production. So what was happening? Well, the continents were fragmenting. And so we go from a situation here around about 150 million years ago to the situation here, and at this point they've expanded into the Tethyan area and to the developing Atlantic. One has to be very careful that they appeared in the Gulf of Mexico just at the point in time when the source rocks were found that caused that explosion 3 years ago in the Gulf of Mexico. That was from Jurassic oil dated by planktic foraminifera, actually here. But you'll notice that that paleogeography completely changes as the continents fly apart in the mid-Cretaceous. And it's not surprising that the diversity of the planktic foraminifera surged as the niches opened up and the oceans became interconnected. Most importantly, in the work we've done in Brazil, is opening up the South Atlantic. And of course, when it was an enclosed basin just before this time, that's when all Angola and Brazil's oil was generated. Once it became an open ocean, you couldn't generate that oil, but it was then trapped in the successions above where it was generated. So looking at the way the continents dispersed the planktic foraminifera, we can then look at how they've changed through time. We can look at the way in which, in terms, they've occupied different water depths. And we can in particular look at the surface waters to see if the acidification effects are taking place during this interval of time when there was 8 to 12 times the present level of PCO2.